Thank you all for coming. It's early morning, and I know this is very strenuous, but it's good to see that not everybody in the ISSPD is an alcoholic. It's a great privilege for me to talk with you this morning, and I'm very grateful to the conference organisers, to Eric Simonson for inviting me here today. It's also a great privilege to be here because it's a nice sense of completion for me, because I was at the first ISSPD conference 25 years ago. And at that time, it was my memory is of a lovely event. The sun was shining, and Eric had done a wonderful job because he'd managed to get the tall ships into town. So it was like going back a couple of hundred years as you walked out of your hotel. The dock was filled with tall sailing boats. Disappointed you didn't do it again this time, Eric, but apart from that, it's a great conference. I'm also very pleased to talk because Kate is here on the panel with me, and we go back a long time, so it's a pleasure to work with her. But I'm also pleased to talk about the theme of the conference. I think it's an interesting and important theme, bridging personality and psychopathology, the person behind the illness. Conference themes are usually sort of things that people take no notice of, the sort of things that conference organisers feel they have to do, and then everybody ignores them. But this, I think, is a really thoughtful theme. It's an important theme. It occurs at a time when our field is in some sort of chaos. We're at a transition point. We're really quite confused about the directions we're taking, the directions we're likely to go on. Last night, Per Vaglum noted over dinner, in a quite totally joking way, that our field doesn't have a theory, it doesn't have a conceptual framework, it doesn't have a classification, and it doesn't seem to have a coherent approach to treatment. Apart from that, the news, I think, is good. It can only get better. Eric reminds us in this conference theme that perhaps we really need to radically rethink the way in which we approach our personality disorder. He invites us really to take stock of this current situation and think about the directions that we're likely to take and the trends that are likely to be important. And one trend that seems to be important is that we need to develop a much more individualized understanding of our patients and a more tailored assessment approach and a more tailored approach to treatment. And so he reminds us of the importance of considering the individual who is personality disordered and not just simply focus on a narrow range of characteristics that constitute disorder. All those of you who treat personality disorder know that our patients are really extremely heterogeneous. They don't fall into nice, neat categories. They're also very individualized in the way in which they present. They present to us with a whole variety of unique characteristics, and if we're going to understand them and treat them, we have to treat them as individuals and recognize and deal with this uniqueness. Other areas of medicine are beginning to recognize this too. In many areas, medicine is moving to more individualized diagnosis, more individualized treatments. For example, recently it became possible to sequence the genome for breast cancer. Now, one would think that breast cancer is a relatively homogeneous condition, but when we sequence the genome, it looks as if there were a fair number, maybe 10, polymorphisms that predict treatment response. Aparicio has recently identified a variety of polymorphisms that seem to predict how patients respond to treatment, maybe as many as 10 of them. And now individualized treatment plans are being developed and tested that tailor treatment to the individual. Now, if we're going to do that for breast cancer, surely we have to do the same sort of thing for personality disorder. Really, for too long, we've neglected the clinical reality of the individuality and heterogeneity of the disorders we treat. What we've done is, in a sense, focus primarily on identifying discrete clusters of characteristics, Some quite narrow, like paranoid and obsessive-compulsive personality disorders. Some a little broader, like antisocial and borderline. But we focused on those and ignored the rest of the personality system. We rarely see these disorders in the context of the rest of the individual's personality. But we know that if we want to treat our patients, we have to take into account these other characteristics as well. And I think we've neglected these issues because what we've become locked into is a relatively narrow, rather simplistic medical model that suggests that there's a primary diathesis for each disorder and that the symptoms and signs of disorder are the result of this diathesis or impairment. The model clearly doesn't seem to be working. So picking up on the conference theme, I want to suggest that we need to develop a more integrative model of personality disorder that can accommodate the heterogeneity that we see in our patients and can also capture the uniqueness of individual cases. Now let me begin by putting this in the context of what seems to be occurring in the field of personality disorder at the present time. If we look back over the last 25 years, as Eric did so elegantly earlier in the week, it's very clear that we've been very successful in establishing personality disorder as an important area of clinical activity and research. This has probably been our major achievement. Research has exploded almost exponentially over the last 25 years. Treatment methods have improved. Access to services has improved in many parts of the world, particularly in Europe and Australasia. All this is good news. But there's a problem. It also seems that there are other sorts of difficulties. What we lack is any sort of coherent body of knowledge about personality disorder. What we've done is to collect a variety of data of all sorts of kinds, but it's very difficult to us to understand what these data actually mean. We've produced a growth of facts, but we can't put those facts in any sort of context. And so the question really arises, are we actually accumulating facts about personality disorder? Are we actually accumulating knowledge about personality disorder? Or are we simply collecting data? That's a problem that really bothers me, and it bothers me because I can't answer it. And I can't answer it because I have no sort of conceptual framework that allows me to understand the data I see. A short time ago, I happened to read Tom Whittaker's Handbook of Personality Disorder from cover to cover. I was sitting in a lake in Malawi and had nothing else to do, so I ploughed through Tom's book, a very fine piece of work. But when I got to the end of it, I thought to myself, what do I really know? What do I really think? And I was really left with a sense of puzzlement and confusion. Nothing to do with the book. It's a good book with very fine chapters. But I came across in the book a mass of facts that I can't organize, I can't synthesize, because I have no conceptual framework. And I think that this is the fate we're in at the present time. We've no way of systematizing the data we're collecting. In many ways, the current state of the study of personality disorder seems to be very reminiscent of what Thomas Kuhn referred to as the pre-paradigmatic stage in the development of science. This is a phase dominated by multiple schools, by intense debates about methods of evidence, about procedures, with intermittent discussion of integration, which nobody takes too seriously. It's a stage in which data collection predominates, but it's difficult to evaluate the data. Kuhn points out that during this phase, scholars are engaged in activity that looks like science, but what they do doesn't amount to a science. And progress is very hard to find, except within the different schools of thought. I don't know whether that applies to personality disorder at the present time, but there do seem to be some similarities, and I leave you to decide how close those similarities are. Kuhn's thesis is that to move out of this phase, We need a paradigm. We need a conceptual approach, some sort of a conceptual framework that allows us to organize information. Currently, personality disorder lacks both. Now, if we think about this, a comprehensive theory of personality disorder seems to be a distant prospect. We were probably a long way from having the information and the concepts required to construct a theory. But what we could perhaps do is to begin to construct a conceptual framework that would, based on some general principles that we could all agree on, that would bring order to our field and consolidate the progress that we've made over the last 25 years. And it's the importance of that conceptual framework that I want to talk about. If we are to develop a conceptual framework for understanding personality disorder, we need to decide, first of all, what it is we want to describe and explain. And I don't think we've given enough attention to that sort of problem. What is it about personality disorder that's important? What is it about the disorder that we want to try and understand and account for in order to treat our patients more effectively? Does that matter? Yes, I think it does, because the conceptual framework we have and what we want to explain determines the levels of explanation we need, the kinds of explanatory concepts that are going to be useful to us in understanding disorder and in treating our patients. The conference theme is important because it draws attention to the sort of phenomena we need to explain, that we need to account for the individual, we need to begin to account for individual differences. How can we approach this? One way is to look at the basic discipline to personality disorder, which has to be personality science. Some years ago, in personality research, Murray, one of the founding figures in modern personality theory, writing an article with Kluckholm, suggested that personality science needs to account for how every person is like all other persons, like some other persons, and like no other person. And that does seem to provide us with the beginnings of an understanding of where we need to go in developing a conceptual model of personality disorder. We need to begin to think about what features are common to all individuals with personality disorder, what features are common to some individuals with personality disorder, and what features are unique to the individual. These issues touch upon a basic problem within personality research that inevitably we have to grapple with in personality disorder. The dilemma between developing a nomothetic science which is concerned with universal principles and basic laws, and the need to understand the individual at an idiographic level. And this has always been a constant tension within personality research, and it's clearly a conflict that we have to address here. We need, both on the one hand, a nomothetic approach that is allow us to organize our understanding about individuals in a universal way, but we also need models that help us to account for the individuality of individual presentations. For the last 20 years, 30 years or so really, we've been dominated by what Murray referred to as the search for those characteristics that are common to some individuals but not others. We've been preoccupied with a search for diagnostic categories and have ignored the rest of the individual and the rest of personality. Now, as we begin to think about what sort of conceptual approach do we need to understand both the individual and the essence of individuality, and at the same time understand the individual within a broader context, it's probably helpful to begin to think about how we manage our patients and how patients present to us and how they present their problems. And I want to talk to you about, try to account for the sort of explanations we need by talking about two patients. Both are young women forced to discontinue their studies because they had problems with unstable emotions, intense anxiety, deliberate self-injury. They showed similar levels of emotional lability and anxiousness. Both had family histories of anxiety disorders and anxiety, suggesting a possible genetic influence. Both responded very similarly to treatment, and as a result, both returned to their studies, completed their degrees, and went on to develop productive careers. But there are important differences between them. One has a very active lifestyle. She's optimistic, open to the future and to the possibilities of the future. She's looking forward to her new career and to building a life for herself. The other, despite working, despite being asymptomatic, remains fearful and apprehensive. This limits her lifestyle, it limits her career opportunities, and it creates intermittent symptoms. Now, how do we explain these sort of differences between our two patients? What sort of concepts do we need to understand what's going on? There are no apparent biological differences in emotional regulation in these patients. There don't appear to be any psychological differences in emotional lability or in anxiousness as we measure it by our various scales. The differences lie in a very different area of explanation and understanding. The differences lie in the meaning and interpretation these two patients place on their problems, their characteristics, and their symptoms. As we heard yesterday from Dr. Carterud, the philosophers have been interested in this problem for some time. And he talked about Paul Ricoeur and his interest in the subjective aspects of individuals' experience of their emotions. And as Ricoeur and other philosophers have pointed out, humans are meaning-seeking individuals, interpretative beings who seek to understand their problems and their experiences and then formulate relatively complex narratives about these experiences. They attribute a whole variety of meanings to the experience that occurs to them. And so they construct narratives that become part of their sense of self and their sense of identity. And this seems to be happening with these sorts of patients. Both of these patients saw their initial emotional distress, this biological dysregulation that seemed to be occurring, as overwhelming and intolerable. We might call this the first level of meaning that they place upon their symptoms. The first patient then begins to think about this problem slightly differently. She reflects upon it and begins to construct higher levels of meaning. Let's refer to this just simply as a higher level meaning structure that begins to emerge. She sees these difficulties as something to be overcome. She's a fierce competitor in a particular sport and particularly good at it. And so she sees her symptoms much as she would a competitor in the sport. Something to be vanquished, that she needs to learn the skills and abilities to be successful, to beat the other person, and in the same way she needs to learn the skills and abilities to manage her symptoms more effectively. She sees this as a problem to overcome, and as in her sport, she expects to win. Her attitude is a much more open one, and as a result, she develops positive goals that give her a sense of direction and purpose and meaning to her life. And in turn, the development of these meaning structures helps to regulate her emotions. So there's a downward regulation from these higher order structures that begins to control the biological dysregulation around her emotionality. So we're beginning to see the importance of these higher order meaning structures in the regulation of behavior. But the second patient is somewhat different. She sees her symptoms as an indication of her vulnerability. She sees herself as flawed, and hence herself as extremely vulnerable in all sorts of circumstances, and so she must be cautious in the way in which she lives her life. She must be careful about what she does, the sort of situations she goes into. She must always be, if you like, on guard. And so her life is filled now not with positive goals, but with negative goals, the things that she wants to avoid. And whereas positive goals help to integrate personality, they help to create a sense of direction to life, negative goals have the opposite effect. They constrict, they constrain, they narrow the focus. And so we see marked differences in these two sorts of patients. These unique features of the patient's interpretation of their symptoms obviously influence treatment. The first patient, the problems become incorporated in a sense into a sense of self in a way that's not negative, but rather more positive. She constructs a self-narrative that improved her emotional control and her emotional regulation. Her interest in sports led her to want to acquire skills and abilities. And so she began to focus very actively in therapy in using the various skills and various techniques to control her emotions and the dysregulation in her affects. And this skill-building approach, the development of these sort of strategies, was sufficient. She was able to go on and use them and construct her life in the ways in which I've talked. The second one is rather different. The symptoms and problems became woven into a meaning structure that was rather negative. Her self-narrative became a negative self-narrative. And what was interesting now is the sense of self that begins to emerge in this constructive process began not to down-regulate the emotions, not to control the emotions, but actually began to amplify them. And we know if we turn to research on the self generally in psychology, it looks that if a behavior is closely linked to the individual's sense of identity, that behavior doesn't seem to respond particularly well to a skill-building approach. We need to begin to address the narratives associated with it. And I think that's what we saw in this sort of patient. The skill-building approach, the development of strategies and techniques to control emotional dysregulation weren't sufficient. We had to go on to deal with these negative self-narratives, and it was only when she began to work on those and began to modulate those that change began to take place. So what these two simple cases, and I've selected them not because they're unusual, but rather the opposite, that they seem to be typical. And these are the things that every psychiatrist does, every psychotherapist does, automatically and intuitively. But if we step back and look at what we're doing here, we're going through a very elaborate process. And if we think what this process means in terms of the models we need to construct to understand and treat personality disorder more effectively, our models have to begin to accommodate the complexity that clinicians are showing in their assessment and understanding of patients. We need clearly to begin to think about different levels of explanation and different levels of description. If we take our patients and look at their problems, and if we want to account for them fully in terms of a conceptual model, our model has to deal with the genetic factors that seem to underlie these problems. It has to deal with the neural structures and the neural mechanisms that are produced by these genetic factors and these genetic modules. We also have to begin to understand the neuropsychological mechanisms associated with these structures. Higher up the system, we need to begin to understand the psychological mechanisms and the psychological processes that are involved. Higher up still, we need to understand the meaning structures that are imposed upon these and associated with these mechanisms, what we might call personal constructs that the individual uses to construe their emotional experiences, or in the terms of cognitive therapy, the schemas people use to understand their experience. But at a higher level still, we need to understand the narratives that people develop to explain their behavior and to create an overarching understanding of their lives that gives a sense of integration and direction. So we need to have explanatory mechanisms at multiple levels, and we need to be prepared to accept that sort of idea of different levels of explanation. Now, this means that our conceptual models of personality disorder have to be relatively complex. And this is obviously a problem. some time ago. George Bernard Shaw, the Irish playwright, wryly noted that for every complex human problem, there is a simple solution that is invariably wrong. This seems to be an important characteristic in the study of personality disorder. We really like simple solutions to complex problems. So we must be wary as clinicians of those models and those frameworks which offer us one-dimensional explanations of personality pathology. We need to be very wary of those theoretical models that are only focused in terms of one level of explanation and focus on one mechanism. Personality disorders are multifactorial in their etiology and multidimensional in their psychopathology. We can't account for that by one-dimensional models. We need models that incorporate different levels of explanation and meaning. It also means something else. It means that all levels of explanation are equally important. No one level is privileged. No one level is more important than the rest. Note how that contrasts with the zeitgeist in contemporary psychiatry, which places emphasis particularly on some levels and ignores others. We need to avoid what Daniel Dennett called greedy reductionism, or what Panksepp and Northup called more recently ruthless reductionism, which means that we need to avoid a focus that is purely biological just as much as we need to avoid a focus purely on the cognitive or purely on the subjective. We have to accept the fact that we need multiple levels of explanation within our concepts. That's something I think that we're finding it hard to deal with. Yesterday, at a symposium that I was talking at on treatment, somebody said, interesting point, that we don't know what produces change in psychotherapy. We don't know what the mechanisms are that produce change. As I thought about that quote or comment last night, overnight, it struck me that it was both right and wrong. It's right in the sense that we don't know at a fundamental level what it is that therapists do that bring about changes in patients. We don't know what it is that changes these basic biological mechanisms. But another level of explanation, we know quite a lot. We know, for example, that the common factors are important. We know that we need to have a structured approach to treatment. We know that we have to build a good relationship. We know that we have to encourage people to self-reflect on their experiences and on our processes. So at that level of explanation, we know absolutely what to do. We know that therapists have to build a good relationship. We know that they have to monitor that alliance, and we know that they have to intervene rapidly when the alliance gets disrupted. That's sufficient for therapists to operate. At another level, we don't know at the neuroscience level what's going on, but that doesn't matter. And we need to accept that there are multiple levels of explanation, and some levels are going to be more developed than others, and we need to tolerate that fact that there are these differences. We can't keep looking for the fundamental or the basic. But this also means something else. It means that we also have to think about within our models something that we really don't like, that these are complex dynamic systems and the chains of a causal relationship go up and down the system. We're used to the idea that these basic biological processes cause everything else. We're not quite so used to the idea that these higher order structures that emerge as a result of these basic biological processes can in turn then influence the processes that created them. And this requires really complex explanations, and we saw this in our patients, that the meaning structures that they developed began to influence these basic biological mechanisms around affect regulation. So we need models that can accommodate upward and downward patterns of causal influence. But now we move into a slightly more problematic area. We saw in our patients that once these self-narratives had begun to emerge, they became capable of generating emotions in themselves. Nice studies, again, on healthy individuals show that the person is quite capable of generating emotions in themselves. This means that some maladaptive behaviors are likely to occur without any biological impairments in basic mechanisms. Cognitive therapy has recognized this from the beginning, that we can have dysfunctional behavior without dysfunctional processes, that people can begin to learn meaning systems that create problems without any dysfunction in the basic mechanisms that underlie them. This creates as an interesting challenge as to what basic model we're going to have to understand personality disorder. It begins to challenge the medical model that has guided our field for the last 100 years, because the medical model that we've adopted is a very simplistic medical model of a diathesis giving rise to symptoms. It's dominated DSM, it continues to dominate the field, but it's a framework of understanding that is constraining us. And as Kendler has pointed out recently, and so has Derek Bolton in his very interesting book, What is Mental Disorder, have pointed out that the medical model doesn't even work for many medical conditions. It works very clearly for things like infectious diseases. It doesn't work for complex diseases with a multifactorial etiology. And that's clearly what we're dealing with the psychiatric disorders. We need a different framework, or if we're going to use a medical model, it has to be a much more sophisticated one than the one we're basing everything on at the present time. I think that we're in a situation where we have to radically rethink this approach to personality disorders and wonder about this model. That doesn't mean to say we don't need biological levels of explanation. We obviously do. But none of the levels of explanation are themselves sufficient. All are necessary, but none are sufficient to understand personality disorder. And that's a basic rule I think we're going to have to learn to live with. Most of the explanations we come up with are going to be necessary, but they're not going to be sufficient. We need multiple levels of explanation. So here we are at this interesting point of whether we continue to adopt this sort of medical model. But that's a debate, and I suppose, and a discussion for another day. But I throw it out as a thought. Now, if we think about what we're trying to do here, we're trying to think about what sort of framework we need to understand personality disorder. We're beginning to identify a framework that has to take into account the nomothetic aspects of personality disorder, but it also can account for individuality and uniqueness. We need a framework with multiple levels of explanation. And none of these levels is more important than the rest. They're all equally important to providing a comprehensive understanding of the individual. Is it possible to construct such a framework? I think what we can probably do is to begin to identify some general principles that can guide us and that can begin to help us to organize our ideas about personality disorder in a much more systematic sort of way. We're a long way from a theory, but we can identify some general principles. I haven't got the time to go into all the principles that I think might be important, but I do want to focus on two. I think we need a conceptual framework for personality disorder based on some solid conceptual foundations. We don't have any foundations at all for our field. It floats in space somehow. We need to begin to anchor it to something more solid. So what might these simple principles be? They're almost naive when we begin to formulate them, but nevertheless, I think they're relatively important. The first principle is an obvious one. You may say it's almost too obvious to talk about. What I'm phrasing is that the normative framework for conceptualizing personality disorder is normal personality. Well, you're going to think, of course it is. But in actual fact, for the last 100 years, the study of personality disorder has totally neglected normal personality. Our concepts, our ideas, show no relationship whatsoever to most of the ideas in the study of normal personality. We haven't drawn on this extensive database, this extensive knowledge base in formulating anything to do with personality disorder. I was interested currently in the concept of self and the self as an integrating principle that might help us to understand personality pathology. And when I turned to the literature in psychiatry, there's virtually no literature apart from some early work by Otto Kernberg and Kohut about the cohesiveness of the self or diffusion of the self or identity. So what do? We normally stovepipe things in our field. We don't look outside our field very much. So normally I think what people do is to construct their own ideas. But there is a rich literature in personality science about self and identity that we can draw upon and look at to help to construct a framework that is useful in understanding patients. So we need to move away from that sort of stovetyping. We need to begin to anchor our concepts of personality disorder, I think, in normal personality. To draw an analogy, I think the situation at the present time in treating and understanding personality disorder is rather akin to a cardiologist who wants to practice cardiology without knowing anything about the normal structure and physiology of the heart. We're constructing models of personality disorder without much reference to normal personality. But really, disorder, as Bolton points out, is a normative concept. We need to compare it to something else to decide what's normal and what's abnormal. The only standard we've got is normal personality. The second principle is equally simple and equally obvious. But if we began to apply it, would radically change the way in which we think about our field. Yesterday, we heard a lot from Dr. Cartwood about how evolution could provide us with an important theoretical context and framework to anchor our ideas about personality pathology. I think he's basically right, although I take a slightly different slant on some of the things he has to say. But clearly, this is the only framework that makes sense. As McAdams and Powell put it recently, personality psychology begins with human nature, and from the standpoint of the biological sciences, human nature is best couched in terms of human evolution. Perhaps the only person who's really appreciated this in this field of personality disorder is Ted Malone, who has sought to relate his concepts to evolutionary principles for many years. So I'm suggesting that we begin to think not just in terms of the overall phenotypic structure of personality disorder, but we begin to think about the underlying mechanisms in terms of an evolutionary process. What are the basic mechanisms that evolved in the course of evolution that underlie personality? The approach that I'm suggesting we adopt recognizes that personality phenotypes, the specific features of personality that we focus on in our clinical practice, are based upon genetic mechanisms that are universal, and that these mechanisms give rise to adaptive structures common to everybody, but differ in degrees in which they're expressed in each individual. These mechanisms form what I'm going to call the basic architecture of personality. So they underlie, if you like, the phenotypic structure of personality disorder. Each adaptive mechanism incorporates genetically based plasticity that permits developmental elaboration of the mechanism in response to the individual's unique environment. In other words, this isn't genetic determinism. These are mechanisms that are tailored and designed to be flexible, designed to respond to the environment in which the individual finds themselves, so that personality becomes tailored to the individual environment of the person. And if we think at this sort of level, we begin to understand why at a biological level we can't find types of personality disorder. Categories don't exist because the underlying biology is too complex. This process allows for a range of phenotypes that become individualized. So I think if we adopted this sort of evolutionary framework as we heard about yesterday, we could begin to adopt models that allow us, on the one hand, to understand the nomothetic aspects of personality disorder, but at the same time account for individuality. And in the few moments I've got left, I want to illustrate this with reference to one particular characteristic, anxiousness, which seems to underlie so much of personality pathology. I'm assuming based on this sort of evolutionary framework, that we all acquire or all have a genetic module that gives rise to the mechanisms underlying anxious behavior. These genetic influences vary in their loading from person to person, but nevertheless we have them, all have them. This is a universal structure, and it gives rise to an adaptive mechanism. And the mechanism really is a threat detection system. All animals, right through the animal kingdom, have some sort of mechanism for detecting threat. And when they identify threat, they then respond, either with fight or flight. They either move away from it or they fight against it. So we have, if you like, as a result of our genetic background, a mechanism that continually scans the environment looking for signs of threat. And when threat is detected, the mechanism then kicks in a response module that decides whether you're going to fight or flight from that situation. Now, that's the basic mechanism. But that mechanism then gets modified in the course of development. It gets modified because it becomes cognitively developed. We develop new ideas about what's threatening in our world. We develop expectancies about what sort of situations we should avoid. We develop our meaning systems about how competent we are to deal with threat. All this modulates the mechanism. So these cognitive components influence both how we respond to threat, but they also modify the mechanism itself. They determine how active the mechanism is, how often it's activated, and how often it gets fired. So if we think of this, we have structures, built-in structures, that allow us to accommodate both individuality and also begin to study, allows us to study the more non-empathetic aspects of personality disorder. I think that sort of approach would, if we began to identify these underlying mechanisms, began to understand their psychological nature, began to understand their biological foundations, would help us to rethink the sort of phenotypic structure of personality disorder. Because currently it's very difficult to tell what produces different behaviors. Behaviors overlap with each other in all sorts of complicated ways. It's very difficult for us to tease out the various components of personality. They all flow together at a phenotypic level. And so with this sort of approach, we could begin to map out things much more clearly, but at the same time, do the thing that Eric is urging us to do, to think about the individual and how disorder gets expressed in the person. So if I step back for a moment, what I'm saying is I think we need to radically rethink the way in which we approach personality disorder. We need to rethink our conceptual models and develop models that allow us to accommodate the complexity of personality disorder. We need to avoid those one-dimensional simple models that our field likes so much. And this would mean, alas, some radical changes in the way in which we approach the subject. It would mean perhaps too that we have to discard some of our cherished beliefs and our cherished ideas about the disorder, which currently don't seem to fit the evidence. Thank you.